I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here at the Hammer Museum. So we all just watched the first of the July 2019 Democratic presidential candidate debates, and now we are so lucky to have this brilliant panel of people to talk about the debates tonight. These folks are in the trenches and really working at the front lines of Democratic politics, and I'm very excited and very grateful that they're giving us their time tonight to comment on the debates. So I'm going to briefly introduce them, and then they'll come up and have a discussion. Zacharie Boisvert is a Los Angeles-based political organizer and consultant. Zachary got involved in the political world while working for environmental nonprofits after the BP oil spill in 2010. During the 2016 election cycle, he worked for both the Sanders and Clinton campaigns, and he spent the last 2.5 years doing grassroots organizing in California and producing political rallies, events, and trainings for campaigns and political organizations around the country. His goal is to build progressive power to defeat Donald Trump. Kandist Mallet is a senior political editor at Blavity, the internet media company and website created for and by Black millennials. As political editor, she keeps an eye on national and international politics and its relationship to Black people in America. As an activist and writer, Kandist also explores topics like technology, global resistance, and fascism. Franita Tolson is a professor of law and the vice dean of faculty and academic affairs at the USC Gould School of Law. Her scholarship and teaching focuses on areas of election law, constitutional law, legal history, and employment discrimination. She's written on a wide range of topics, including partisan gerrymandering, the Elections Clause, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the 14th and 15th Amendments. Her forthcoming book, In Congress We Trust, The Evolution of Federal Voting Rights Enforcement from the Founding to the Present, will be published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. And finally, Bill Zimmerman has managed or served as the lead media consultant in nearly 200 political campaigns. His clients included candidates running for every office from mayor to president. Among his many ballot initiative campaigns was California's Prop 215, which launched the current effort to legalize marijuana. He helped build MoveOn.org and has worked for the ACLU, the NRDC, and numerous other public interest groups. Bill earned a PhD from University of Chicago and is the author of Troublemaker, a memoir from the front lines of the 60s. And I've asked Bill to, in addition to being a panelist tonight, to informally serve as a moderator during this discussion. So please join me in welcoming Zacharie Boisvert, Kandist Mallet, Franita Tolson, and Bill Zimmerman.
Testing. Okay, thank you. Well, that was quite a show. Let's see if we can make some sense out of it. There are a lot of ways of measuring or evaluating a political debate. Did the candidates have a good command of public policy? Did they display a sense of humor? Were they appropriately aggressive? And so on. We can look at all of that during the course of the discussion, but let's begin by trying to go a little deeper and ask, did the candidates or were the candidates able to advance their own campaign strategies through their performance in the debate tonight? Now, it's true, I guess, that many of the candidates, or some of the candidates on the stage don't really have a campaign strategy. They're up there auditioning for VP or a cabinet position, and their only real interest is attracting enough attention to make it into the next debate. But others do have strategies. Bernie Sanders, for example, is trying to argue to those Americans who favor a thoroughgoing progressive agenda that the best way to achieve it is through a political revolution that moves our country away from capitalist domination and toward some elements of democratic socialism. Elizabeth Warren is appealing to the same voters, many of the same voters, with much the same agenda, but she's arguing that you can achieve that agenda through strict regulation and tax policy without moving toward democratic socialism controlling the economy. I'd like to begin by asking the panel who they thought did a better job of advancing their own strategy tonight, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders? Who wants to start?
I guess I'll start.
Okay.
I think Elizabeth Warren did a better job in the sense that she has been articulating policy preferences for a while now in terms of making her positions public and enlisting various scholars and supporters and sort of laying out her vision for the country. And so tonight what you saw was her laying out specifics in terms of what she would do if she's president. Bernie Sanders, he was a close second, I think. He definitely had some specifics. He had a vision for the country. The problem, and I don't want to get too much into demeanor, sometimes it gets lost when you're waving your hands and yelling, right? So I think sort of watching him and her and contrasting the two, it's entirely possible that he also had maybe just as many specifics as she did, but it got lost in delivery for me. Another thing that struck me, though, is you had Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren on one side, and then you had clear moderates on the other. I mean, tonight there was a clear line that I thought was missing from the other debates. So you had Delaney and Hickenlooper and Tim Ryan, and there was a pretty clear contrast, and I thought that was a really positive thing to take from the debate because it gave you a sense of where the candidates were on the issues. So I thought it was less of a contrast between Bernie and Elizabeth as opposed to a contrast between them as progressives versus the moderates, and I thought that was useful for primary voters.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, I think I appreciated that they didn't actually go at each other. They kind of helped and supported each other. And I think it's interesting that if you look at this debate and then the previous debate, it's kind of been like, let's attack the socialists or let's attack the progressives, which to me kind of is like a red flag for the Democratic Party that they're still not really listening to the progressive base. And I think that was a large problem in 2016. We all like to talk about Russia, but we don't like to talk about why people didn't come out for Hillary. And so I appreciated the fact that they kind of supported each other in that asset of like when it came to defending Medicare for all or eradicating student debt for everyone. And I think I'd rather focus on that as have like progressives unifying together versus like who did better in that sense.
I'd have to agree with both Kandist and Franita that I think the biggest boon that both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders gave to the progressive movement as well as their own campaigns was actively agreeing with one another and defending the progressive agenda back to back, side by side against the more moderate candidates on that stage. I do think that both of their messaging appeals to not necessarily the same voters, and there was a great poll that came out of Politico showing some of the differences in their bases. And Elizabeth Warren has a very academic appeal. She's the wonkier of the two who dives into policies, and that's going to appeal to folks who take time out of their days to come to a debate watch party, who are paying very close attention to the issues, to the candidates, to the race. And she's able to dive into that policy. When she talked about the wealth tax, I thought that was one of the best answers of the debate. But when Senator Sanders is able to tell a clear story of bringing patients over the border to Canada where they're able to pay 1/10 of the cost to get a vial of insulin for $30 rather than $300, that appeals to people on a more raw emotional level. And I think his presentation as well is a little more emotional, which he's granted the right to be as a man on the stage also. We need to note that. But they both did a great job defending against the more centrist and moderate arguments on stage.
Now, between the progressives and the moderates, it seemed to me there were two candidates trying to carve out a middle position, if you will, Beto and Mayor Pete. How do you think they did? Because they are often put in competition with each other for a segment of the progressive electorate that doesn't want to go as far as Bernie and Elizabeth do, but still are in pursuit of a relatively progressive agenda.
So I think Mayor Pete did a really good job tonight, just in terms of, he's a very articulate and eloquent speaker. He speaks so well, right? It's nice to say that about a white guy. But I thought that he did an excellent job of tapping into both sort of intellect and emotion. And one powerful moment that stood out to me was not necessarily policy. It's when he talked about congressional Republicans and when history writes their story and when they look back at this moment and this is what they'll be known for, right? So he kept making those statements that really would appeal to the emotion of people watching. And I thought he did a really good job of that. Beto, it was kind of a mixed bag for me. I thought that he did pretty well, but I don't know if he did enough to really stand out. And in part, a lot of the problems was the format. You know, the format didn't really give candidates a chance to speak at length about their positions, and I think that he was one of the candidates that kind of suffered because of the format, because there were various points in the debate where I thought he had a good start. Particularly when he talked about sort of his time in El Paso and how he pushed back against the notion that immigration is a problem by pointing to his own district as an example of where immigration works and how the community has done really well. But you didn't really get to hear a lot of detail, and I think in part it was because they were trying to play up the differences between Warren and Sanders and the people on the moderate side. So because he fell in the middle, he didn't get a lot of attention.
I think Mayor Pete had a great moment where he said, whatever policy we put out, they're going to say is extreme leftist. We might as well, fight for what we believe in. And I think that is kind of the key message for the Democratic Party and the message of the night, and that should be kind of moved forward for the rest of the primary. And it was surprising coming from him. I didn't really expect that, and I think that kind of had people maybe more interested in him. I also think that Beto he hasn't really had his moment in either one of the debates, and I'm kind of, he's one of those people who are often given lots of media attention and named a lot, but I don't know why. I'm still not really sure. And so, I appreciated him bringing up reparations and that segment of the debate, but I still really not necessarily impressed.
After the first debate, a lot of people felt that Beto didn't live up to expectations and thought that this debate was a make or break moment for him. Do you think he made it?
No.
I don't think he did. And for me, when he talked about recriminalizing immigrants who are coming over because his immigration reform would be comprehensive enough that if they then crossed illegally, it should still be criminal, I think ignores the humanity of what's going on at the border and what's going on in Central America.
Yeah. Well, going back to healthcare, who won that debate? We had a very vigorous debate in terms of Medicare for all or some form of single payer versus maintaining, quote, pieces of the current system or the best of the current system and combining it with reforms. How do you think that debate came across to the majority of Democratic voters who are legitimately confused? And, I saw, unfortunately, the moderators pretty much, as was pointed out by one of the candidates, taking the Republican talking point about taxes going up. This has been the central obstacle to passing a single-payer healthcare system for decades now. Opponents cry out about tax increases. When voters hear tax increases, they run for the door. And we have not succeeded as progressive Democrats in educating the electorate about the fact that, yes, taxes will go up, but overall expenditures will go down because they won't be paying premiums or co-pays or any of the other expenses associated with the current system. So we've failed to get that point across, and that's one of the biggest obstacles to building support for a single-payer system. And there was the CNN moderator not only repeating that talking point, but emphasizing it several times. And I wonder if that sabotaged the ability of the candidates to get across not only the need for single payer, but exactly how it would work, so that people began to see it as a practical system rather than something sprouting from the brain of an idealist with no practical experience.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember that CNN is a corporation, right? And so they have a vested interest in how they frame the questions and what kind of questions they ask.
And
So
they have advertisers who come from health and insurance and the drug industry.
exactly. So it was kind of sabotaged in the first place. And I don't think people walked away knowing more of what single payer or Medicare for all is, unfortunately. And I don't think like the other moderate participants of the debate really helped that. And, you know, as a Democratic Party, there has been a lot of like internal sort of like fighting on whether or not Medicare for all is something that we should support or they should support. And I think it's interesting that like they kept being like coded language, like, you know, your wish list or your, you know, like fantasy ideas. And it's like, and that kind of just seems like they're not really listening to people when it comes to like what, you know, people are excited about and care about. And when Medicare for all was mentioned, you can hear cheering both here and at the debate stage. And so I think people are still probably confused on what it is. And when it's important for like media to help educate on what actually policies are. But unfortunately, CNN kind of sabotaged that question.
I do think the question was absolutely biased. And I also think that if you look at the American public, they understand that it is immoral that people have to decide to put food on the table or to buy their medicine while pharmaceutical executives are walking away with the biggest bonuses they've ever seen, especially after they hooked America on opioids. I think the winners of the debate on healthcare were the left. Again, you had Senator Sanders and Senator Warren defending their policies together, and those two candidates alone in the center of that stage hold upwards of 30% of the support of the Democratic base in this primary.
Zach, would you say the same thing about climate change? Because it seems like there's a similar dynamic. There's a progressive position on climate change that strikes moderates as impractical or overly expensive. Those issues are harped upon to oppose fundamental climate change, as was advocated by Sanders, Warren, and others tonight. Did we lose ground on climate change tonight, or did we gain ground?
Personally, I don't think there was enough time devoted to climate change, and I know they've said there won't be a debate entirely devoted to climate change. There will be a forum, which is a start. I'm still hoping that there's a debate, but we need a lot more conversation there because it was said a couple of times on the debate stage, it's an existential crisis, not just for our country, but for the planet, for every living thing. And I think it's a disservice to the public, it's a disservice to the candidates when we talk about all of these issues in vacuums one at a time without looking at how they intersect and also without looking at their intersectionality. So if you want to talk about climate change, you also have to talk about what else that affects. It also affects health. Marianne Williamson might have actually done the best job of tying all of those issues together, and she wasn't afraid to talk about other issues when answering a question on one specific issue.
Now, she was a surprise, wasn't she? She got a lot of applause in this room and a lot of applause in the auditorium in which she was speaking. Can we imagine her as a serious candidate for the White House? Yes. Well, some of us can, for sure.
I will say she was the only candidate to tie Flint to racism, right? You know, I mean, she had her moments. She was not afraid to talk about reparations. She was not afraid to call people on the fact that they lacked moral authority because they took donations from corporations. You know, I mean, she was a truth teller tonight. And so even if she doesn't get the nomination, sorry, I'm just saying even if, you know, I do think she's an important addition to the conversation because she is making the points that the other candidates need to talk about and they need to stop running from.
She's not afraid of her heart. Mm-hmm. She's not afraid of her heart.
You agree?
She acknowledges it's a thing in her body.
I agree with that. I don't necessarily think she's going to have too much of a future, but I do appreciate her presence. And I do kind of feel like her demeanor in tonight's debate was different than the first, and so it was easier to hear what she was saying.
And I think there was a time where not many people could imagine Donald Trump as president of the United States, and if Marianne Williamson got nearly as much media attention as he did during his primary, then you might see a lot of difference in the polls. I think the media does have to reckon with the influence it plays and the weight that it holds in these decisions.
All right. The other candidate with a real strategy for winning is Amy Klobuchar. How did she do tonight? She certainly tried to carve out the moderate middle as her base and project herself as a practical politician who not only can get things done but can win in red states. Do you think she succeeded in moving herself forward tonight?
I would say no. I don't really know where she stands still. And I think like at this point of debate, like to me, I got the vibe of someone who is a politician and who is trying to make sure every movement is perfect and every word they're saying is perfect. And I didn't really, like, I don't know who you are or where you kind of stand. And so I don't know,
For me, she loses me on the subject of free college, and this is something I struggle with Mayor Pete as well, is they play this game where they say the wealthiest children shouldn't have free college because they can afford it. They shouldn't have their student debt canceled because they can afford it. But when you look at the issues not in a vacuum, but how they intersect, you would have the wealthiest people paying more in taxes, whether it's 2 cents on the dollar or whether it's raising the top marginal tax bracket to over 70% to where it was in the 1950s. And they would pay for it. And they would get a little break at the beginning when they're going to college or as their debt is being canceled. But after that, they would keep paying for it. And everybody else, the working class, the middle class, would be the ones to benefit. And since it's our tax dollars that bailed out Wall Street, I do think it's our turn to get a bailout ourselves.
All right, let's look for a minute at the so-called minor candidates up there tonight. Who impressed you? And who left you feeling that he or she will not be in the next debate?
Where's my list? Okay. Hickenlooper can go home. Tim Ryan can go home. Bullock can go home. As a matter of fact, he needs to go home and run for the Senate. Everybody is forgetting about the Senate. Amy can go home too, guys. I'm sorry. And don't get me wrong. So to come back to your earlier question, last year I taught a class called Electing a President. And we had a very interesting conversation about what it takes to elect a president, and it was a very honest conversation. One of the reasons why Donald Trump won was because of his celebrity, right? One of the reasons Obama won is, in addition to being brilliant, is because he also came off as a celebrity. There's a something that she just doesn't have. And I was looking for it throughout the debate, and my class couldn't even tell you what it is. It's just it. It's like the Beyonce effect, right? Elizabeth Warren has it. She doesn't really have it. And so she's a brilliant woman, but I don't think that she's gonna go far because she's boring. And it's unfortunate that our presidential politics have come down to a popularity contest, but it matters. But the Delaney and Hickenlooper and others, they need to consider running for the Senate. The Senate matters in 2020. And so I understand, and you know, this notion of trying to vie for VP and cabinet positions and everything, but you also have to think about governance as a whole. You know, a Democratic president needs a Democratic Congress. And I just don't think that a lot of these candidates are looking at the long game.
Now, one candidate who did make an impression on your list was Mr. Delaney.
Not in a good way, though.
Not in a good way for a progressive. No, certainly not. But if you frame the question in terms of who's going to be in the next debate and who's going to be missing on the podium, seems to me Delaney's going to be there. Because he does have the presence and the forcefulness in arguing his positions to be at least interesting as a debater.
Bill, could you remind us again, because it's not just about whether the money is, on the next debate, there has to be how many, it has to be a certain, they have to hit a certain number in the polls. Do you know what the cutoff is?
Please.
I don't know what that number is, but I do know that there are going to be fewer people on the stage. That is, the criteria will be such that you won't have 20 people who pass the threshold. Do any of you know what the new criteria will be?
I believe it's 2%, and I wish it weren't the case, but I also think that after tonight's performance, but also with the amount of screen time he was given by the moderators, by CNN, it's very likely that John Delaney does see a boost, and he was being painted as the right wing of the Democratic Party tonight, which we do have to remember is still alive and well.
Right, right. Are there other questions or comments from the audience? Because we have a couple of microphones set up and people should feel free to, let me see, it's hard to see over these. There's a question over there.
Yeah, hi.
Yeah.
Thanks. Can you hear me? A very interesting discussion. To me, there were three people on that board, that debate. There was Williamson. She went at the dark issues at the heart of the American soul, which is this racism issue and the ability of politicians and the public to face it squarely. It's a horrible, horrible, ugly, ugly history. She brought that out powerfully. Elizabeth and Bernie. Elizabeth is brilliant. She's laid out her campaign in absolute detail. You know what she stands for. Bernie has been true and solid all his life. Those are two people you can depend on. And Williamson really rings a tone that must be heard. Delaney and the others, they were just like roto-rooters going in there and chopping up the discussion so that people would be puzzled, as perhaps they themselves are. I don't know. But it just seemed to me that Elizabeth and Bernie know what they're talking about. They're communicating it clearly. And Williamson really, really needs to be heard. I don't see her as a president, but I think her voice should be heard every time.
Others?
Parlaying, oh, hello there. Parlaying off the Williamson conversation, what do you think it is that makes us so afraid of vulnerability and of letting our heart be on our sleeves? It's weird because we all acknowledge that we want to feel safe and protected, that we're vulnerable, we're obsessed with love songs and Hollywood movies, and yet when it comes to politics and someone is leading with their heart forward, it's like, who is this hippie nonsense? She's using words like psychic, and why are we so afraid of things that rationality can't explain, when we know science proves that rationality and observable, what we can observe, is not the limits of our universe? So why do you think that the political discourse, and just the discourse that we have with each other, gets so uncomfortable when people start acknowledging what she's talking about?
Toxic masculinity, right? This is why we still have candidates trying to do push-ups against each other, right? Like, for a long time, you know, politics has been dominated by men who show strength through sort of their rhetoric, right? And it's a street fight. And so because of that, they think that if they talk tough, and this is why remember the debate about the nuclear weapons and how Elizabeth Warren was getting sort of pushback about the idea of us not being preemptive and using our nuclear weapons. It's because it projected weakness to some of these other candidates, right? They would rather blow up the country in order to appear strong because of toxic masculinity.
But that's why we need Marianne Williamson, because she talks about the root problems that we need to address before we talk about anything else, before we talk about nuclear proliferation, before we talk about Medicaid. It is a bizarre thing. Root problems that we need to address as a nation, and she goes there.
It's like the house is burning down, and we're talking about, like, well, what color are we going to paint the house? It's going to burn. It's burning. So it's weird that we'll spend 2.5 hours or 3 hours on this national debate stage when we have literally tens of millions of people chiming in and viewing, right? And to be able to talk about the idiosyncrasies, like the actual nuts and bolts of what built this house, what has built this house of America and of this planet. It's weird that we can't address who are we, America? Who are we, planet? It's a weird thing that we don't want to talk about, but we're really quick to talk about why we do or do not want Medicaid or for all. But before we can even get there, stripping down to even talking about what does it mean? What does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be 7.5 billion people sharing this planet? What do we owe each other and what do we owe ourselves because we have breath that we don't ask for and we have a heart that just, you know?
I think we appreciate your advocacy and the validity of the points you're raising. But there's also the question of winning an election. And none of us want to sacrifice an opportunity to get rid of Trump by backing a candidate who may be right in the way you're describing, but who has no chance of winning. And while Marianne Williamson might get a decent vote here in Los Angeles and in parts of New York City and in other urban centers around the country, it's very hard to imagine her carrying the Electoral College in a national election. And I think that's what gives a lot of people pause, not just in terms of supporting her, but also in terms of supporting the perspective that you just articulated, which may be a valid perspective, but will not be seen as a practical political program by a vast majority of the American people who will make this decision for us.
It's just so weird that, I mean, you seem like such a smart man, and it's bizarre to me that I'm hearing the exact same thing you said 4 years ago about Bernie Sanders, and here he is once again on the debate stage, and we're like, Medicare for all, like, these are just preposterous things, right? Like, inevitably, we are moving towards a spiritual revolution. We are moving towards a place where God is a much larger thing, right?
Your question, please. One question.
I have no question. I stand with Your Honor.
Go ahead.
One of my questions was kind of centering around a broader notion of what does a presidential election look like in a capitalistic society, and more specifically dialing into the advertising around this presidential debate. I mean, some of us were shuffling in and out during these breaks, but for those of us that were staying, I saw Liberty Mutual. I saw a, broadly speaking, basically America's biopharmaceutical industry. And I kind of have to ask, is advertising what they were really paying for?
Well, I don't think so. I think they're paying for influence. And I think that the kind of influence that you saw in the sponsorship of these debates is the kind of influence that helps control the outcome of not just American political elections, but the American political process. The candidates tonight talked about the influence of lobbyists, and it's hard to exaggerate the influence those lobbyists have in Washington. You know, the average congressman or congresswoman serving in the House of Representatives spends roughly 80 to 95% of their time raising money because they have to run for office every 2 years. And in a contested House election these days, candidates can spend $2 to $5 million. That was unheard of 20, 30 years ago in congressional races. But now the influence of television and online advertising has required candidates to raise tons of money, and you can only do that by focusing on fundraising all the time. Every minute you spend on fundraising is not only a minute away from the legislative work that you have to do, but a minute that creates a mindset that you're dependent on the wealthy out there and that they get to talk to you more. You have to listen to them and their perspectives more than average working people, and it begins to shape how you see the world and ultimately how you vote on legislation. We couldn't have designed a worse system for electing national leaders than the one we have.
And just to sort of kind of touch upon what you just said and then what you were saying previously, I think like if you look at sort of how the debates go, even how like the CNN started, it sounded like a WWE match, like Bernie Sanders is gonna go head to head against Warren. And it's just like, what are we doing? This is like really serious and we're talking about it. And it's, you know, people are given a minute to respond, and the way it's set up, like this isn't really how you're supposed to decide who gets to control your life, right? Like it should be more sort of larger conversation, and we should be able to have, you know, dream bigger and have, you know, and look at our country and see what's really going on, and, you know, not just look at the symptoms, but what's actually happening. And a large part of that is because, you know, yes, we have a capitalist structure, and, you know, CNN, which is a capitalist company, is hosting these debates, and we're not having it government funded in some kind of way where we can make sure that, you know, private interest isn't kind of leading our votes or how we're seeing this. So I think both of those things are kind of connected.
Yeah, the very discussion tonight was formatted by CNN, not on the basis of what can deliver the most important information to an electorate that's got a very important decision to make, but what's the most convenient way to get 20 people talking at the same time. You know, if every candidate has 1 minute to answer questions and a 1 minute opening and closing statement, and there are 10 of them up there, you can't possibly have an in-depth conversation that treats these issues seriously. And I think what we saw tonight in the healthcare discussion, in the climate discussion, in the immigration discussion, was a cartoon of what a political discussion should be. The candidates did not have an opportunity to really confront each other. They didn't listen to each other. They didn't respond except antagonistically to what each other said. So the format itself undermines the ability to deliver meaningful information to the electorate.
Hey panel, thanks for coming. You guys have been awesome. So after this debate, who wins Michigan with the greatest probability? In your eyes.
It's a long way to go before that decision is made. I don't think you can tell.
Yeah, I would absolutely say Michigan's not won, but during the general election, I worked for Hillary Clinton's campaign managing the northern 40 counties of Michigan. If you're familiar with Michigan, you hold up your hand. The northern 40 counties are the fingers, but they're also the upper peninsula above. And those are counties that overwhelmingly went for Sanders and also overwhelmingly went for Trump. And Donald Trump won 39 out of those 40 counties. So I think when we look at Michigan, we're again reconciling with so many of the moderate candidates talking about enterprise and manufacturing, but claiming that a universal health care or Medicare for all system would strip away the last thing that union laborers have. And I think that's absolutely the wrong framework. I think the people of Michigan, the people of Ohio, the people in the Rust Belt, they're also affected by not having health care, whether they're in a union or not, or paying too high in premiums. They're affected by not having a living wage. They're seeing jobs disappear. They're seeing their water still poisoned after 4 years, and it's only now becoming a talking point again because people are running for president. So I think a bold, progressive agenda is very much what it will take to re-energize the working class. Rural America as well. People think Donald Trump won Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin with a bunch of Obama voters, but he won the election with fewer votes than Romney or McCain got when they lost to Obama. And that's because the Democrats ran on a centrist message and not on a message that spoke to people's values for their vision for the future and that actually got them to turn out to the polls.
I found it interesting tonight that Beto made the point about the 38 electoral votes in Texas. You know, the two states in the United States that can most fundamentally change politics in America are Texas and Florida. They're both solidly Republican states historically, but they both have become purple states more recently. With the influx of Puerto Ricans into southern Miami as a result of the disaster that occurred there a year ago during the hurricane, and with the changing demographics in Texas, the Latino vote accounting for a larger and larger piece of the overall state vote, Beto was making an interesting point. And an interesting argument that he, being from Texas and having run for the Senate in Texas, coming close to winning, has a chance of bringing Texas into the Democratic column in the presidential election. If he did that, the Democrat would win. Those 38 electoral college votes would be enough to offset Trump winning every place that he won last time, assuming he can do that. Clearly, that's become his electoral strategy. But that was an interesting point that Beto made, and I wonder to what extent it'll resonate with people around the country.
I think it'll resonate because but for the wrong reasons, and let me explain why. We've been having a conversation about electability, which is why Joe Biden is doing so well. And people forget Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes. They were just in the wrong places, right? So it suggests that women aren't electable, when in fact the woman won the most votes the last time. So I think that his argument resonates, but I hate that it resonates because people are concerned about the electability of the women in the race. I think people find comfort with that safety net, though, right? If he's like, I can deliver Texas, and I think the latest poll shows him beating Trump in Texas by like 11 percentage points, which is incredible, right? But I think it sort of provides a safety net, a blanket of sorts, for those concerned about the Electoral College. But I just hope it doesn't come at the expense of convincing people that a woman can't win.
And the question is, can another Democrat also prevail in Texas? You know, because if Beto's winning by 11, I wouldn't be surprised if other candidates are coming close to that.
Just wanted to go back for 1 second when you guys were talking about how the way that the debates are set up. Mine's really working. I usually talk so loud that no one has a problem hearing me, but it doesn't allow for great conversations and in-depth conversation about the issues. And I thought for a long time that the British system was much better, and we've got Boris Johnson. So when you were talking about this, you opened up this discussion about like whose strategy seemed to work. And the truth is, our political system kind of sucks on many levels. But the bottom line is, they do have to act like that. If they cannot figure out, a candidate cannot figure out a strategy that works for these short blurbs. Later on, the whole game is strategy, and whose campaign team is going to be able to figure out what's the best strategy to overcome Trump. So, I'm not happy with it either, and I think the American public is badly served by it, but isn't that part, if they can't pass that bar of figuring out in a really creative way, oh, I'm going to bring this up in a 1-minute blurb, but I'm going to be able to direct people to my website or further discuss this.
Well, I think you're exactly right. But you raised the question of strategy, so let's talk about it for a minute. I think what we saw tonight is there are two fundamentally different strategies that Democratic candidates have. There's the one group that says we have to beat Trump, and the way to do that is by being as practical, mainstream, and moderate as we possibly can, so that we don't scare off potential support. The other basic strategy on display tonight was the opposite of that. The way to organize voters to support us is to be bold, to talk about structural change. And when Elizabeth Warren uses that phrase, she's really saying quite the same thing that Bernie is saying when he talks about a political revolution. So these two strategic thrusts are going to be what the Democratic primary is all about. And tomorrow night we're going to see Joe Biden, and he's going to argue very forcefully for being the candidate who can most effectively carry that moderate strategy across the finish line. But I wonder, Biden is ahead in all of the polls, but all of those polls show him with roughly 35% of support. Now, Biden has near universal name identification, and 35% support means 65% opposition. So everybody knows him, and 65% of Democrats are saying, no, he's not the guy I'm going to support. I wonder if that's a repudiation of the moderate strategy or a repudiation of Joe Biden as an individual. What do you think?
I would say
Both.
Yeah, definitely both. And then a large part, I think, the moderate strategy as well, though. I do think a big lesson that should be learned from 2016 should be that listen to the progressives and don't ignore them, and include them as part of the conversation. And let's not pretend that things like the Green New Deal and Medicare for All are only fantasies. But people want real change, and you can't just say, I'm not Trump, and think people are going to come out. Because if you do, then we're going to have Trump 2020. You have to give people something better than just fear. And I think if that's going to be their only campaign, is that I'm the VP that was with Obama, then I don't think people are going to come out.
I was really struck by the two people in the middle of the stage are two very progressive people, and the public option is the moderate position now. I think that shows how far the party has come. And so I think the fact that that wouldn't have passed in 2009, and now it's the moderate position is insane, right? And so I think a lot of people just see Joe Biden as a relic of that past, and that the party has kind of left him behind. But his name recognition does help him, which is why he's at 35%.
The other interesting dynamic is the generational one. And I think Mayor Pete spoke to this a great deal. But the power of that argument is that you can change the electorate. And if you are bold and you are speaking to young progressives, and most progressives in the electorate these days are young, there is an old-young dichotomy within the Democratic Party in which older people tend to be more moderate and younger people tend to be more progressive, although there are obvious turnovers. As we see, the leading progressives are Bernie and Warren, who are both over 70 years old. But the other way to win elections is to change the turnout. And if a bold approach by one of the progressive candidates can get more young people and more minority people and more poor people and more single moms to come out and vote than normally do vote in elections, then the usual calculations of how you win get altered very fundamentally and very quickly. Yes, sir.
Is there any way to do
Please wait for the mic.
One's on the way.
Mr. Zimmerman, how would you, or could we go about developing a national approach to the election like Stacey Abrams used in Georgia? I mean, have an enormous grassroots effort from all the impassioned Democrats who care about their country.
Well, Sanders and Warren are building larger grassroots movements than we've ever seen before in this country, just as Obama was able to build one in 2008. And that's really the hope.
How do we know that? I'm not challenging you. I'm just wondering, how do we know that today, that they really do have sizable grassroots movements?
I think by the investment they've made financially in organizing. They're spending a great deal of money hiring people to be organizers and hiring people to coordinate those organizers on a massive scale. Now, years ago, when we ran large-scale campaigns, whether they were for Senate or governor on the state level or president on the national level, we regularly spent 70 to 80% of the money that we were able to raise on television advertising. That's no longer the case. I mean, it is the case for Republicans, of course. And in addition to television advertising, we now have to advertise online. And that soaks up a good deal of capital. But when you're managing a campaign, you've got a fundamental decision to make about how much money you're going to spend on communications, with direct communications with the electorate, and how much money you're going to invest in grassroots politics. And I think we've seen since 2008 and the success of the Obama campaign a shift in national politics toward the building of grassroots organizations. And from what I'm able to see, the kind of financial investment that the progressive candidates are making in grassroots organizing is very substantial. And you know, a political campaign in some sense is like a business. You spend money on things and you look at the results. And if your money isn't producing results, you shift your money somewhere else where it will produce results. So I can't give you facts and figures about the size of the movements they're building, but the fact that they continue to invest in grassroots organizing tells me that they're being successful in building those organizations.
Thank you. Just a couple of other observations. As I listened to all the candidates tonight, I was wondering how many people that would call themselves independents would think that anyone on that stage was a moderate. And I'm not sure. I think what we as Democrats consider moderate is probably pretty far left for a large part of the populace in the country. Number one. And number two, I didn't like the moderators asking forceful questions that I thought were Republican talking points. But anybody who wants to be a candidate has got to have articulate and persuasive answers for those questions. I mean, so it wasn't a bad practice run for them to have to deal with those hostile questions.
I think that's a really interesting observation because if you ask me, and this might be a generational thing, I think a lot of the policies and positions that are denoted by the media by moderate candidates as far left are actually a lot more center than you would imagine if you look at the rest of the world, but also if you just ask an American layman what they think on the issues without the framing. There was a survey, how do you feel about Obamacare? How do you feel about the Affordable Care Act? People were overwhelmingly in favor of the Affordable Care Act, and it's the same bill. If you can get rid of that framing and reframe the issues in a way that's digestible for people who aren't well studied in politics, they're going to say healthcare should be a right, people should be paid a living wage, we shouldn't be giving corporate welfare to organizations like Walmart and Amazon. These are not radical leftist ideas, but it is interesting to think, what would a Republican say if they saw Steve Bullock? Would they think he's moderate or would they think he's left? That's right. Are there any Republicans in the audience? Oh, that is LA.
One final question. One final question.
I left my hand down until I noticed nobody else raised theirs. This is my second point. There's an impact that you can see that comes from underneath and is a sudden furtive attack, and it comes from forces that I can symbolize by saying Cambridge Analytica. There is a program, there's a film showing now called The Great Hack. And this shows that a lot of what we see on the stage, there are these forces waiting in the wings to slam whatever is going to come up against the forces that are representing the actions of Cambridge Analytica. And I haven't heard any discussion about any of this. These are huge tectonic forces that go on through Facebook and Google and are focusing on who, it's their psychometric studies of who's unstable and who can I influence, and then they target those persons with fake news that will sway them to vote in whatever way they want. These are powerful, powerful new forces. It's an incredible thing. I'm not talking scare tactics here. I mean, this is stuff that people who've been watching this have known about for a long time. But what do you say about this? I mean, we watch these debates and we say, oh, gee, I like that person. But what's waiting in the wings to slam that person if they don't step in, if they're not in alignment with what these dark forces, if I may call them that, are standing?
Well, I think you're raising a very interesting question. You know, when I first got into politics in the 1970s, I was very suspicious of using television advertising because I saw it as a manipulative medium. You have to squeeze what you're saying into 30 seconds. You have an opportunity to use music and emotional pictures to manipulate how people view the issues that you're trying to discuss. But I quickly learned that if you don't use television advertising, however manipulative it is, you wind up losing because it's a very powerful means of communication and a very inexpensive means of communication if you think about a mass audience. Yes, individual commercials are very expensive, but they reach so many people that on a unit basis, they're the cheapest form of communications. Now, how do we deal with Cambridge Analytica today and the techniques that they've developed? Do we try to regulate and regulate them out of business, pass laws that prevent people from doing the kinds of things that they do? Or do Democrats join Republicans and use this technology and allow elections to be escalated in the same way that wars get escalated when new weapons are produced? And once your opponent starts using a new weapon, you have to as well. I wouldn't like to be a legislator trying to figure out how to legally ban those techniques because I know I will be right up against the First Amendment every time a law gets passed and somebody argues that it's a limitation of free speech. I don't know what to do. The ability to manipulate people through those kinds of techniques has become enormous. But it's very difficult to figure out how to regulate it, how to stop it, how to expose it, and how to keep it from influencing elections in the future.
I agree. I'm just saying that this is a force to be reckoned with.
Yes.
And the movie calls it the weaponization of personal data collected by Facebook and Google. It's the weaponization, the criminal weaponization of personal data. Tough problem.
Indeed. Yes, sir.
I'm actually a data scientist, and I think
Please wait for the mic. Final question.
it's not a question, but I work in data science, and I see this as a bigger issue of data laws that need to be modernized. GDPR is in Europe. Where is our law? We need to also think about that in a candidate of if they understand technology. Like we need to really grasp these ideas. Excuse me. Ideas, because these are very important moving forward if we want to progress. And everyone should be literate on their personal data, is all I'm saying. Thank you.
And just to try and answer the question from the gentleman, I think these are very strong forces that we contend with, and whether it's digital advertising or fake accounts or even more traditional forms of advertising like television and radio, you have power yourself. And it is your duty in this moment to realize that power. And I'm listed on the bill as an organizer, and that's what I am. So in the field, we call it a field pitch. I'm going to ask each and every one of you, whoever your candidate is, go out and work for them, make phone calls for them, send texts for them, donate if you can, if you're able, knock on doors. And when it comes time, a year from now, that we have a nominee, go out and do it twice as hard. Because that's the only way we're going to beat this. They're trying to suppress the vote. They're trying to keep people away, and they're trying to divide us. But if we come together and we use the power of our voice, which each and every one of us only has one of, we can make the change happen. But it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to come by itself.
Well, that's a great place to end our discussion tonight. Thank you, Zach. Thank all of you for coming. We're going to be back here tomorrow night watching the second half of this debate. Please join us tomorrow night as well. Good night.